Hey everybody out there, this is Seto, and today guys, before I start today's video, I want to quickly apologize for my finger. I know a lot of you guys are probably going to see my finger in this video all bloodied and whatnot and be like, oh my gosh, what the heck happened to your finger, Seto? So pretty much what happened is I woke up this morning, got dressed, took a shower, and came downstairs to cook me some breakfast. I was cutting up some parsley, got distracted, and cut the end of my finger a little bit. So it really bled really bad. So that happened about 30 minutes ago, and it's pretty bad. But I'll be fine. I'll survive. But that should be a reminder to everybody out there. Anytime you're using sharp objects, pay attention so you don't hurt yourself. So my apologies for this video and future videos that you see me with this big wad of bandage on my finger. So guys, today we're going to talk about, is Yu-Gi-Oh getting more complicated and harder to learn? Now, it's something that I've heard other players say. I've heard players coming back into the game, that played maybe in, the earlier days of Yu-Gi-Oh, or like in the early mid 2000s, when they're coming back into the game, they're like, this game has got a lot more complicated. And if you haven't been around in the last couple of years, it seems to have gotten a little bit more complicated because each archetype has its own thing, and if you're playing against that archetype, you have to kind of know what they're doing because each little archetype has its own little thing that it does, it seems like now. It's not like back in the day where when I learned Yu-Gi-Oh! Originally, it was pretty straightforward. You knew what your good traps were. You knew how to summon monsters. It was pretty straightforward. You normal summon. You would tribute monsters for like Summon Skull, Blue Eyes White Dragon if you had two summon. It was pretty straightforward. And once in a while you would use fusions. But then GX came along, and that made fusions a little bit more complicated. Not so much that it was, you couldn't recognize how to play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And then synchros came along, XYZs came along, and now we have pendulum summoning. So when I look back on it now and I think to myself, if I was a new player coming into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And got overwhelmed by all this stuff, exceeds, synchros, pendulum summoning, that's a lot to learn. I mean, there's a lot of players out there that I've seen come back into the game that haven't been around since like GX or the early synchro days, back when Stardust Dragon was considered broken. Yes, there was a time that card was considered too broken. But they haven't been playing for a long time, and they get back in the game. They're like, they got XYZs now. You have to know the rulings with XYZs. I mean, people remember, if you remember when XYZs first came out, people didn't know all those rulings about detaching and would the monsters still get their effect, and that was confusing. So each new thing that gets introduced into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a little bit more confusing. It gets a little confusing at first when people are trying it out. I think in a way they've kind of tried to fix that with pendulum summoning, with excuse me, I'm saying that wrong. Errating cards like, capture turtle, things that say you only can use this card once per turn, so it doesn't create crazy combos. But it just seems to me it's overwhelming to learn all this stuff, and if you haven't been keeping up with the game or just paying attention to what's been happening in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, it can be really hard because there's so many rule changes and whatnot. I mean, I'm not talking about like the basic things, but it takes a while. It really does to learn like all the ins and outs of a deck. To learn, you have to play with it a whole bunch of times. It takes a while to grasp the concepts of what is a good card, what makes a card good and what makes a card not good, and things like that. Granted, sometimes we can just look at a card and say, oh, that's a very good card. But a lot of times it does take some time, for that learning curve to us to understand the potential of a card, like I talked in my last video. But it's something I just want to ask you guys. If you were starting out in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, or if you are currently starting out in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, or you haven't been playing the game for a long time, does the game seem a little bit more complex and harder to learn than it was back in the day? There's so many layers to Yu-Gi-Oh now. It just seems a little bit more complicated, and it's just some good food for thought I want to talk about. And it's made me wonder, and I'll probably do another video in the future talking about, will that eventually cause Yu-Gi-Oh to not be very popular because it's got so many different layers. I mean, I've seen Magic players, they come into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh. Excuse me, not Magic players. Magic players, they'll leave Magic, stop playing Magic for a while, and they'll come right back into the game of Magic, and it hasn't really changed for them. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you are gone for 2 years, the game completely changes. It just seems a little bit more fast-paced now than it used to be. But granted, I think that's due to a whole bunch of different things. I think that's due to the factor that, you know, internet is more available. Not for me, but for a lot of other people, internet is very available. People communicate more. It's not like it was back in the old days where pretty much what made good players was your locals. If your locals was a good locals, it produced good players through a natural process. But now it's pretty much you're able to become a better player because there's so many there's so many different other ways to do that. It's so many other different ways to learn the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Instead of just learning, the rule book nowadays doesn't really help you. It doesn't tell you all that extra stuff, really. It gives you a brief overview, but it's not as helpful, and it just feels like compared to my generation and playing Yu-Gi-Oh! The beginning, it's a lot more harder. So what do you think? Do you think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is becoming more complex and harder to learn, especially for players, stepping back into the game or starting to learn the game right off the bat? What are your thoughts on this? And this is just some good food for thought I want to discuss about. And till next time, guys, take care, have fun dueling, good luck dueling, and I'll see you guys next time. Seto Kaiba, I'm out of here, guys.